Hello and welcome to FACT's webinar called Grazing for Resilience, Bouncing Forward from Catastrophic Events. Our presenters today are Justin Morris and Linda Poole and Eric Tucker from the National Center for Appropriate Technology, or NCAT. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating this session. I thank you all for joining us. So before we dive in, let me just take a minute or two for a few quick introductions. Food Animal Concerns Trust or FACT. We are a national nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in Illinois. We do work across the country, and we work to ensure that all food-producing animals are raised in a healthy and humane manner. We accomplish this by supporting humane farmers, promoting policies that make food from animals safe and helpful to eat, and by helping consumers make informed food choices. My colleague Samantha and I, who you see on the screen with me, run FACT's Humane Farming Program, which works with livestock and poultry farmers from all across the country. We offer grants, scholarships, personalized materials, mentorship, and of course, webinars on a variety of topics. So I invite you to please visit our website at foodanimalconcerns.org/farmer to learn more about these opportunities. And at this time, I am quite pleased to introduce our guest presenters, Justin Morris, Linda Poole. They are regenerative grazing specialists with the ATRA Sustainable Agriculture, a program managed by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, or NCAT. We are super lucky to have them both with us here just today to share their experience and their expertise. So I think without further ado, I am going to hand the floor over to you, Linda, to get us started.
Great. I am so excited to be here. It's really fun to watch everybody signing in so that we can see where you're from. And let's see if I can get this. It's hiding my ability to turn this into, I'm going to stop a share for a second. It won't let me see it to turn it into a slideshow. Let's see, I think we're good to go now. Let's see. No, maybe not. Larissa, it's hiding my controls. We tried everything here to make sure we have it right, and yet
Linda, are you on one monitor? Is that?
Actually, I'm on two, but it's given me some grief here. Can you pull it up and then I can do remote controls with yours?
Well, why don't you just cue me on the slides, because I think that would
slow us down.
Yeah, in terms of just based on other technology issues.
Okay. Okay, so you're going to pull yours up. Good.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me get that up for you. Okay, let me stop my share.
Best laid plans always fall apart. Justin and I have put so much time into getting this ready that of course things are going to go sideways. For anyone who was in our last webinar, you'll know that internet issues tend to plague both Justin and myself, and we have all these ways to avoid it, and somehow my way to avoid it made sure that a bad thing happened. So Bud Williams would have said that we create what we anticipate, and I anticipated problems, and so we got them. So here we go. Let's talk about grazing for resilience. And when we're talking about that, you're seeing our title, which is Bouncing Forward from Catastrophic Events, rather than bouncing back. And the idea is, can we use adversity to catapult us into the type of future that we really want to have, instead of just reacting to bad things that happen? So next slide, please. We'll start with just a little bit about NCAT, and the National Center for Appropriate Technology has been around since the 1970s, working to develop sustainable solutions that reduce poverty strengthen self-reliance, and protect natural resources. And you can reach us on the web in various different ways, mostly through atra.ncat.org. Next, please. We have a lot of different programs within that we work on. Some of you may be familiar with our Arm to Farm program, which is for veterans returning who want to go into agriculture. We're about to have a bunch of new week-long sessions in that are being offered in multiple states, New Mexico, Texas, I don't remember where else, but a wonderful resource for veterans. A program that both Justin and I work on is a new one for NCAT. It's called Soil for Water. We'll hear a little bit more about that as we move forward, but basically it's an idea of using regenerative agriculture and collaborative partnerships to capture and hold more water in the soil. And we have the AgriSolar Clearinghouse, which is brings together NCAT's sustainable energy side with our regenerative agriculture side, and talking about managing solar arrays to also benefit agriculture. So we hope that you'll also think about visiting agrisolarclearinghouse.org. Next, please. So our plan for the meeting today is pretty straightforward. You'll get to hear just a little bit about who Justin and I are, and then we're going to jump right into a catastrophe that we're right in the middle of. I see there's other people from Montana. We've got a big one going, don't we? So we'll hear a little bit about the catastrophe I'm in. Justin will give us Grazing 101, so some ideas about how our management affects our abilities to cope with and rebound from catastrophe. Then we'll talk about specific pathways to resilience, and then we'll save those Q&A questions for the end. And again, if you'll type those into the Q&A section, we'll make sure we get to those. I think the main thing to think about as we begin this meeting is that with everything we do, with every catastrophe that we face, really what we're trying to think about is not just how to get through this one, but the idea of 7 generations down the line. Can we, as we're coping with what we're faced with right now, think about building a resilient future for generations to come on the land that we cherish? So let's talk about how to do that with the next slide, please. So my place in my life is pretty simple. I grew up on a ranch, and my professional training is in range, watershed, and wildlife management, master's degree from Oregon State. I've worked always in dry country, the dry side of Washington, Oregon, Colorado, and Montana, and have always continued with having some livestock around, sometimes a few, sometimes many, for 40 years now. Mostly what I do now is sheep. So on to Justin. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Linda. Hopefully everyone can hear me fairly clearly. I'm kind of battling a little bit of a cold here, so got a little bit of a frog in my throat. So hopefully I'll be able to last through the presentation. So I'm Justin Morris. I'm based in Southeast Idaho, and my professional background or training is in animal science, range and forage science. And I've been providing technical assistance for about the last, past 16 or 17 years on grazing lands, and over about the last 5 years or so also on croplands. And prior to my employment with NCAT, I worked for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in many positions in Oregon, Utah, Montana, and Wisconsin. And throughout my professional career working for NRCS, I had the opportunity to be there at trainings and training new NRCS staff or seasoned NRCS staff on things related to grazing and soil health, ranging from states from Hawaii all the way to New York. So I've had an opportunity to work in some wet environments as well as some dry environments along in my career. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we're going along here in this presentation, the one thing that we're really trying to keep in mind here is how, you know, we can use a natural disaster or catastrophe, and how we can use that as a way to be able to create the type of change that we hope to be able to provide in the future. And it's really easy, especially, you know, in this day and age, to get negative and remain negative for a long time. But I've often found in life that the only way that I grow personally is through challenges and through, you know, what other people looking at my own life would say, well, that looks like that's a catastrophe. But it's also stimulated a lot of change for myself, and I've seen how that has actually helped to stimulate change for other people, whether it's personally or also with their working landscapes. Next slide, please. So this is a little graph that Linda and I have been working on, and you're going to see this again later on in the presentation. But this is going to kind of be a major point of our presentation today, is that no matter what state your pasture is in, you know, if you've got a pasture that's in a very healthy state, as you see on the green line up above, or if it's in a very low state, very unhealthy state, as you see with the red line on the bottom of the graph, that no matter where you're at, and of course our message is mostly to the folks that, you know, if you've been decimated by drought or some other type of catastrophe, that as bad as that catastrophe is, that there is a way forward. And so a big part of our message today really is that there is a silver lining, even in the face of where fields or pastures have been decimated, whether it's fire or grasshoppers or drought or floods, that given the right type of management and the right type of approach to our landscape, that we can actually create a future that is more resilient than what we're currently seeing. Next slide, please. All right, I'll pivot this back over to you, Linda. Take it away.
Need to unmute there. You know, what Justin says about there is hope and that you can be stronger by surviving the challenges. You know, that's really good news to all of us who are in Montana. The drought that we're in right now started in June of 2020. And at my place, in over a 14-month period of time, I got 4 inches of moisture. In that period of time, I should have got over a foot. So it's pretty tough. In addition to that, we had low temperatures down to minus 47 Fahrenheit. We had high temperatures of 113. And according to Kathy Whitlock, this is the worst situation in some ways 1,000 years or 11,000 years. I don't know if that helps us as we're going through it, other than to say it really is tough. So we've got dry, we've got grasshoppers. Some areas have had fires. Honestly, it's so dry and so much of our country looks like the upper left corner right now that fires are not the issue that they might have been, just because there's nothing to burn, nothing to eat, but not much to burn either. And, you know, the inevitable outcome of drought like this is it creates hydrophobic soils. And so it's inevitable that when it rains again, we will have a flood. So good to know that we can bounce back as we go along. Next slide, please. So the specific condition on my place is as I said, I run mainly sheep and I run mainly a pasture-based system. And starting back in May 2020, once I got done lambing out my ewes, they went on to pasture. And so that's May 2020. And in April, I bring them in, I put them on full feed, shear them, put them on full feed and lamb. And then I turn them out, and they're usually on pasture then until next year's lambing. And I just supplement with feed whenever I need to keep them going, you know, when we have bad winters and such. Next slide, please. But what happened this year is in May, about the time I'm turning my ewes and lambs out, the grasshoppers came. And this is what the grasshoppers looked like in the center at the top. That's how many grasshoppers there were. And I had stockpiled enough feed to make it through from the spring of 2020 to the spring of 2022. But then in came the grasshoppers. So that created a lot of problems. By July, I was having to supplement the pasture because the grasshoppers had eaten everything green. They left the standing cured vegetation, moved on to the neighbors and ate them out of house and home. By September, I sold most of the stock, a big part of the adults and almost all the lambs. And since then, I've been doing bale grazing, and then the sheep will be back in the corrals, getting ready for their lambs in May, at which point I hope it rains again. But where I'm at with my catastrophe is, I don't know, are we almost done? Are we halfway through? Are we just getting started? The uncertainty of that weighs heavy. And I think that's something that we have in common, whatever type of catastrophe we're going through, is when is it going to end and how am I going to bounce back? And so let's turn it over to Justin to talk specifically about how to do that, how to bounce back.
Okay, next slide, please. All right, thank you, Linda. As we advance our discussion today, I'd like to first provide an understanding of how graziers are ultimately connected to soil life and why that's so important. So to begin with, graziers use fences and other tools like low-stress livestock handling techniques to control several things. You know, they control when livestock show up in a field, they control how long livestock stay there, when the livestock return based on plant recovery, and the number of animals that are in one place at a time, which is also known as stock density. Next slide, please. So livestock directly affect plants through the amount of above ground growth they leave behind after grazing, whether that growth is left completely intact or trampled to the ground. Next slide, please. Leaves are the primary site of photosynthesis, and it's in the leaves where sugars and other important compounds are produced. Sunlight plus carbon dioxide and water create glucose along with oxygen gas. And glucose is really the most basic molecule of chemical energy, which is then converted into hundreds of different compounds. Next slide, please. But when livestock remove leaves through grazing, more than just what is seen above ground is affected. So what you see before you is data from probably one of the most frequently cited grazing studies in history. This research actually goes all the way back to 1955. And it shows that root growth begins to be affected by a single grazing event when 50% or more of the above ground biomass has been removed. And when 80% or more of the above ground biomass has been removed, 100% of the roots stop growing for at least 12 days. Next slide, please. In this photo, we see a great example of how grazing management impacts not only the above ground growth of plants, but even more importantly, root development. Grazing management that utilizes some system of rotation where livestock move through a sequence of fields at the rate of plant growth allows plants to achieve a much greater above ground and below ground growth compared to plants of the same species, where livestock have continual access to the same plants at any time. So continuous grazing leads to what is called overgrazing. While we all know that roots are essential for acquiring nutrients and water, consider for a moment how these plants would handle a drought. How would a plant fare if it has a root system going down 2 or 3 inches, like the tall fescue that's continuously raised? As soon as that rain or irrigation shuts off, those plants stop growing immediately and will become dormant. This contrasts sharply with the plants pictured here with a much deeper root system that can continue to be green and growing even after the rain or irrigation shuts off. Now, just for a point of reference here, folks, I inserted the numbers in black on this slide with arrows pointing to those same numbers on the yardstick and the tape measure so that you can see the depth of the plant roots. Okay, next slide, please. So plants directly affect the soil in several ways. While it can be very evident that plants protect and insulate the soil from raindrop impact, as well as insulating soils from fluctuations in temperatures, what is less well known is what's going on underneath the soil at the roots. Next slide, please. So while scientists have long known for a long time about life in the soil, that knowledge has not trickled down into agriculture on a broad scale until very recently. One of the most incredible processes in nature is the relationship between roots and soil life. In the root zone of the plant, roots release sugars and other compounds into the soil to feed bacteria and fungi. These bacteria and fungi, in return, access areas of the soil that are unreachable by plant roots to be able to gather mineral nutrients that plants need. Next slide, please. In the process of soil life gathering the nutrients plants need, combined with other compounds being released by the roots, soil particles begin clumping together, creating space in the soil, a process that is known as soil aggregation. This allows water to more easily infiltrate and be held in the soil for future plant use. Additionally, gas exchange between the soil and the atmosphere is improved, allowing oxygen into the soil and carbon dioxide to escape out of the soil. So the photo that you see there on your left shows very, very small strands of or filaments of beneficial fungi that are actually connecting soil particles together, which is an excellent example of soil aggregation in action. The photo on the right shows a small root starting to colonize the soil. And so you see like these little white strands of beneficial fungi that have entered the root and are moving across the soil, which then increases the plant's nutrient absorptive capabilities. Notice in both of these pictures how crumbly the structure is of these soils, which is also a great indicator of healthy soils. Next slide, please. When soils improve with a greater abundance and diversity of soil life, as well as soil structure, plant health and growth are enhanced. Next slide, please. There we go. So how can plant health and growth be improved with healthier soils? Well, plants need sunlight, they need water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide. While healthier soils don't influence the amount of sunlight plants receive, they totally impact the availability of water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. So let's first take a look at water availability. When water comes in the form of rain, for water to get into the plant, it must first infiltrate into the soil. Soils with a nice crumbly structure that looks like cottage cheese or chocolate cake from those pictures that you saw 2 slides ago, those kinds of soils with that kind of structure allows water to get into and be held in the soil. The deeper that crumbly structure goes, the greater the amount of water that can be held for future plant use. This is what enables a pasture to remain green long after a drought has commenced, while other pastures immediately turn brown as soon as the drought begins. Next slide, please. Next, nutrients become more available to plants because healthier soils generally support a greater population and diversity of soil life. Plants prefer to absorb minerals that have been converted into an organic form, meaning that the minerals like phosphorus and potassium, for example, have been attached to a carbon chain by either a bacteria or a fungi, rather than being absorbed in their simpler, non-organic form. In other words, the bacteria and fungi are the bridge for plant nutrient acquisition. Plants prefer this method of nutrient absorption because it takes less energy from the plant to assemble the compounds it needs, since minerals attached to a carbon chain are essentially pre-assembled or pre-built compounds, rather than starting to build those same compounds from scratch. So I'm a big tractor fan, so I'm throwing in a little tractor analogy for you here. So this is really kind of like very similar to two types of tractor factories. The less efficient factory makes every individual part, including melting down the steel to cast the nuts and the bolts all the way to assembly in the same factory. That would be like the largest tractor factory in the world to do that. On the other hand, the more efficient tractor factory has all the parts arrive in pre-assembled packages, like the engine, the transmission, the axles, and the cab, which then only requires a minimal amount of energy and time to bolt those components together to build a tractor. So in like manner, the plant prefers that more efficient method for acquiring nutrients as pre-built compounds because it takes less energy to do it. And the good news is, folks, is that if it takes less energy to acquire those nutrients, then some of that extra energy can be used for growth and staying greener longer. Next slide, please. Finally, plants have a huge requirement for carbon dioxide. Where does that carbon dioxide come from? Well, it comes from oxygen-dependent soil life that are exhaling. While the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is around 420 parts per million, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the soil is in the realms of 10,000 parts per million. As the soil life population increases, the amount of carbon dioxide in the soil also increases. As the carbon dioxide concentration increases, it rises out of the soil and is absorbed by the pores in the underside of the leaves so that photosynthesis is increased. And as photosynthesis increases, so does plant growth. Only healthy, well-aggregated soils allow this to happen at a high rate. Next slide, please. As plant health and growth are improved, the quality and quantity of the livestock's diet also improves. Plants with greater access to mineral nutrients can become a more complete meal, potentially reducing the need for mineral supplements. And a greater amount of forage can translate into livestock staying on pasture longer. This can result in less time being confined at a feed bunk, where disease and sickness are usually more prevalent. Next slide, please. As livestock graze from a healthier, more productive, and diverse landscape, the need for mechanically harvested forage and supplementation can decrease significantly. This can reduce costs while improving the profitability and quality of life for the grazier. As you can see, this cycle begins with the grazier managing through the livestock and plants to ultimately improve the soil. This focus on the soil can return huge rewards into the future, which are magnified back through the plants and livestock to help the grazier become more successful than they were in the past before the catastrophe. So in the grand scheme of things, it all starts and ends with the grazier. Next slide, please. So I told you you're going to see this graph again. So here it is. This represents our understanding of how pastures generally respond after a major disturbance or catastrophe. The horizontal axis represents time, with the arrow pointing to the right showing time progressing forward. Because each field represents a unique combination of soil types, soil life, vegetation, microclimate, and management, the time it takes to achieve a high level of pasture health cannot be predicted exactly. This is why there's no definite time value at the far right. The vertical axis represents the level of health for a pasture ranging from a lower level of health at the bottom to a higher level of health at the top. The red curve represents a pasture that's in a lower state of health, where plants are continuously overgrazed with lots of bare soil and high levels of compaction. The green curve represents a pasture that's in a higher state of health, where plants are not grazed until fully recovered from grazing, and there's minimal to no bare soil, and you have a nice crumbly soil texture. The less steep a curve is, like where letters A and C are positioned, the slower the rate of improvement. And the steeper the curve is, like where letters B are positioned, the faster the rate of improvement. So let's focus on this red line. The lower the pasture health is before catastrophe, when a catastrophic event does happen, the health of the pasture begins to decline almost immediately and very abruptly, kind of like falling off of a cliff. And not only does pasture health decline quickly and abruptly, but it declines much farther compared to the healthier pasture. As the pasture begins to recover, where you see red letter A, the rate or speed of improvement is very slow and may not even be noticeable for quite some time. Given enough time and rest, where we see red letter B, eventually pasture health improves more rapidly as it exceeds the pre-catastrophic state. And if grazing management continues to be proactive, eventually a much higher state of health can be achieved that far surpasses the pre-catastrophic state. In stark contrast to the less healthy pastures, the healthy pastures that you see with the green line maintain their state of health for a while, even after the catastrophe has started. Eventually, the healthier pasture decreases somewhat in health, but the decline is gradual and doesn't drop very far. Because of the initial state of health before the catastrophe, along with continued proactive grazing management that is constantly monitoring for full plant recovery, the recovery period, as shown with green letters A, B, and C, is very short. So consider for a moment, folks, how this all translates into potential profit or loss, as well as stress on the grazier. When a catastrophe happens and pasture health rapidly drops, suddenly, the grazier begins operating in panic mode. Rather than destocking immediately, many folks retain all their livestock, hoping that the effects of the catastrophe will suddenly end. But if the catastrophe is a drought, no one knows when it will end. As a result, many choose to hold the course by having their livestock graze their pastures down lower and lower until there's nothing left. At this point, livestock have to be put on a full ration of hay to prevent losing condition and performance. Or they must be sold or moved elsewhere until the pastures recover. All three of these options can be very expensive. Hay during droughts is often hard to purchase and very, very costly. This can cause a lot of financial and emotional stress. If livestock are sold all at once in the middle of a drought, the price received for the animals will likely be very low, which can also cause a lot of financial and emotional stress. The third option of moving livestock to a completely different location may not be even possible, and if it is, that may also come at a very high cost. Finally, if we look at how long it takes for that less healthy pasture to return to its pre-catastrophic state, the pasture spends a lot of time in that very slow rate of recovery, requiring a lot of expensive inputs in the meantime. So the difference between these two pasture scenarios is a lot like flying in an airplane. When pastures are in a low state of health, this is like a plane flying at a very low altitude, such as right after takeoff or when getting ready to land. If a problem occurs at such low altitudes, the pilot has just only a matter of seconds to make the right decision from a very short list of options to safely land the plane. This is like that sudden drop we see with the red line just after a catastrophe. On the other hand, a healthy pasture is like a plane flying at 35,000 feet. If something happens in this situation, a pilot has a much longer time to make decisions while also having a lot more options to choose from. This is like that delayed and more gradual drop we see with the green line that doesn't fall too far, but then regains its previous state of health very quickly. Generally, given equal management efforts, pastures in warmer and wetter environments can improve in a shorter time period than in cooler and drier environments. And that's simply because soil life is more active where temperatures are warmer and where moisture is not limiting. So the big question is how do we get onto the steep part of this curve sooner rather than later? Well, the answer there lies in we follow the soil health principles. Next slide, please. So here are the 4 soil health principles. They include keeping the soil covered, minimizing soil disturbance, increasing biodiversity, and maintaining continuous living roots. And you may be wondering, well, I've seen 5 soil health principles published on the internet or elsewhere. Well, since we're in a grazing discussion, it kind of goes without saying that we're including livestock in its full integration of animals throughout the entire pasture ecosystem. Next slide, please. So many think that the only way soil can be disturbed in a grazing situation is through repeated hoof impact on the soil surface, such as near water tanks or other areas where livestock tend to congregate or trail. Interestingly, overgrazing can be an even greater soil disturbance than hoof impact. But how's that possible? Overgrazing is when a plant is grazed before it has had a chance to recover from either a prior grazing event or another disturbance. When that happens, the plant's leaf area is reduced to such an extent that the plant cannot create enough sugars through photosynthesis to replenish leaf area and provide the sugars soil life need around the root zone. When soil life were not adequately fed from the plant, soil organisms like bacteria begin breaking down the glue-like compounds that hold soil particles together. In essence, the soil collapses on itself, losing that crumbly structure, which then impedes water from going in and carbon dioxide from going out. So what can we do to improve soil health and recover from a catastrophe? So we begin by not allowing livestock to enter a pasture until plants have reached the elongation phase, which is phase 2 or later. If the pasture has been decimated where there's lots of bare ground, it may be best to delay livestock entry until plants reach the reproductive growth phase or phase 3. Next slide, please. So from a plant perspective, livestock can arrive any time of the year if plants are recovered from either the prior grazing, winter dormancy, or other major disturbance. So in essence, we're talking about ensuring that grazing doesn't happen until plants are in the late phase 2 growth stage or later. From a livestock perspective, grazing plants that are at least at the late phase 2 growth stage is best for them because it provides enough fiber along with high carbohydrates and protein for proper rumination and good rates of gain. Also, if the pasture is in a dry environment, it may be best to allow plants to reach phase 3 growth stage prior to livestock returning to allow the greatest amount of vegetation to be produced for covering the soil surface and produce seed to germinate new plants. Next slide, please. So when we look at the second guideline here, we're looking at, it's really not about what we allow livestock to take through grazing, but what we allow to be left behind. So we need to leave leaves, which is why the second grazing guideline comes in, is that we should stop grazing at the bottom of phase 2 or earlier. And to go along with that, if you might remember from probably about 15 minutes ago when we talked about the influence of grazing on plant root growth and development, we need to leave at least 50% or more of the above ground plant canopy intact. And if we're in very dry environments, that percentage will likely go up significantly so that we can minimize the amount of bare soil, bare ground, to keep that soil cool and to reduce raindrop impact. Next slide, please. If livestock are kept in the pasture longer so that it is grazed more severely, then it will take considerably longer for plants to grow back to the pre-grazed height. The difference in grazing time between removing the animals once they reach the bottom of phase 2 and keeping them there so they aren't taken out until they reach the bottom of phase 1, that could be less than a day in certain situations. The reason why this happens, folks, is because as plants are grazed more severely, fewer and fewer leaves remain to photosynthesize. Added to this is the issue that the lowest leaves are the oldest and they're the least photosynthetically active, and you have two good reasons for slow plant recovery. Grazing durations that are short enough to keep the plant in the most rapid phase of plant growth greatly reduces the amount of time it takes for plants to recover while protecting the soil with a living plant canopy. Next slide, please. So then our third point here is that we need to make sure that we have enough paddocks per herd for a 3-day graze period when plants are growing fast, such as during the late spring and early summer, and a 5-day graze period during periods of slower plant growth, such as in midsummer or as we're cooling down into the fall. Next slide, please. Our fourth point here is that as we are ensuring that we have enough paddocks per herd to kind of fit into that 3-day graze period and 5-day graze period for fast and slow growth, what will enable us to be able to make that happen more easily is that we have to be monitoring the growth rates of the plants. So this is where this guideline number 4 really comes into play, is that we need to monitor those pasture growth rates to adjust how fast or slow livestock are moving through the rotation. So you could kind of say that we really want to move animals through a grazing rotation at the rate at which plants are regrowing. If we move too quickly through the rotation and the animals arrive back at the beginning point too soon, then we're overgrazing. If we don't move animals fast enough and the forage, in other words, kind of gets away from us, then we have some other options that we have to consider. But oftentimes we can get into a situation where we could arrive in pastures where the quality of the forage may not be very good at that point if it's been in the reproductive state for a long, long time. Next slide, please. Our fifth guideline here is don't bring animals back until the pasture has fully recovered. And I could not say this enough times in this webinar, is that this is kind of an absolute that if we allow animals to go back into a pasture and those plants have not fully recovered yet, then at that point we're going to be overgrazing. And if we're in a rotation, we're going to be rotationally overgrazing, which is actually probably worse than set stock continuous grazing. Next slide, please. So when we start talking about, full recovery for plants, what does that look like? When are plants fully recovered? So here's 4 rough guidelines that we can use. So plants regrown to at least the top of the elongation growth phase, which would be that phase 2 or later. No evidence of previous grazing, such as chewed leaf tips. We're going to be looking for plants that get as dark green as possible. And then also looking at those oldest leaves of the plant, which are attached at the bottom. And when you start seeing the leaf tips, they're starting to take on a little bit of brown. That's where it will start. It'll start browning at the leaf tips at the very bottom. That can also be a good indicator that that plant is basically saying, I'm ready to be grazed. Next slide, please. Our sixth guideline here is if no pasture is fully recovered before the second graze, then at that point we need to move livestock someplace. We can't keep them in the rotation any longer. We're going to have to move them to one area, and we're going to either need to feed hay there or some supplementary feed until plant recovery takes place, or they need to go someplace else off-site. If we keep the animals there in the rotation and you don't isolate them to just one area, then you are rotationally overgrazing at that point, and that is actually worse than just having no fences and just letting the animals have a free-for-all. Because once you have your fields set up in the paddocks, now you are very much grazing evenly, and you are overgrazing very evenly across the entire pasture landscape. Next slide, please. Finally, just wanted to wrap up here is that we need to fluctuate grazing timing, duration, frequency, and intensity. And the reason why this is important is for a couple reasons. Number one, if we have animals that, if you have like a set rotation where the animals are always in, pasture 2 at the same time of the year every single year, then what will happen over a period of time is the diversity in that pasture will change tremendously. So if you're there at a time period when it's the cooler part of the year and it's more cool season dominant, then you will end up through your management end up changing the species composition, and a lot of the higher or more preferentially grazed plants, the ones that are the most palatable, often those most palatable plants need a longer recovery period compared to plants that are more sod forming and that they can quickly recover after grazing. So over a period of time, you can actually see that diversity actually start to revert, and you could get a more of a monoculture type pasture as a result. The other important reason also is that just like if you're on an exercise regimen, and most people who've been on exercise regimens know that, if you do the same thing day in and day out, eventually you get muscle memory, your body adapts to whatever stress you're putting on it. The pasture is the same way. So if you don't vary the timing, the duration, how frequently that pasture is grazed, you don't vary the stock density or the intensity of that, then eventually you're going to start plateauing out. And then when we talk about trying to get onto that steep part of that recovery curve, you're going to start to that curve is going to start flattening out a lot sooner for you if you don't change things up. So there's a lot of beauty and a lot of wisdom in changing things up from one year to the next. And I think that's the end of my part here. Linda, we'll go ahead and transition it back over to you.
Thanks, Justin. Sometimes when we're, next slide, please, Larissa. Sometimes when we are trying to think about how to get that, to get off a plateau, it's hard to be brave enough to really change up things. And that's where nature, when they throws you a curveball, is there a way that you can use that catastrophe to catapult you to better outcomes? And Justin's laid a foundation of pasture dynamics and soil health. So you have those principles in your mind to think about now, how can I bring this forward? But, the other part that comes in, it's not all just science. Sometimes it's philosophy and it's faith and belief in this. And some words that I think of in my mind as I'm trying to turn my catastrophe into an opportunity, I think of the Serenity Prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Another thing that I think of is the late Bud Williams. I got to spend 2 days with Bud and Eunice, just the three of us. Probably one of the most important things he told me is that you create what you anticipate. You create what you anticipate. If you anticipate that this is the end of your operation, you'll build it that way. Another thing he told me is that he has never failed in his life. And I'm like, I know you're good, bud, but nobody's that good. And he said, well, it's true, because I never give up. If I have a goal, I do it until I succeed. And he says, when it comes to moving cows, he says, I live longer than a cow. And, I just keep trying until it's done. So that's an important thing for me. We're going to hear just a little bit later from New Zealand shepherd Doug Avery. And he has a saying that I really love. And that's, when things go wrong, you either win or you learn. And either of those help you succeed in the future. And lastly, Nicole Masters, one of our gurus of soil science, tells us about the 5 M's that determine your success moving forward. And I would encourage you to look up Nicole if you don't know what all 5 of those M's are. But what she says is the major one that will determine your success is your mindset. Next slide, please. So, whoops, there we go. So can we think of a disaster as a pivot point? And this is going to be something that I'm not going to delve into very far, because it's going to depend upon your particular holistic goals. It's going to depend upon your context. You're going to want to talk to your family. You're going to want to talk to your extension agent, your NRCS people, maybe your university, maybe mentors, to answer some questions about how can I have this be something that helps me prosper rather than something that puts me out of business. And thinking about that is, I think one of the reasons this drought hurts me so much is I don't think of it as a drought. I think of this as the new normal. What's ahead of me, what's in my windshield, I think is different than what's in my rearview mirror. So going back to doing what I did before the drought is not going to be a solution. I need to think about things that'll work in a time of extreme temperatures and catastrophic events. Some of those events will have changed your topsoil. If you've had a flood and it's taken the topsoil off or turned it all anaerobic, you've got a different situation. If fire has burned it down, you've got a different situation. So one of the keys to think about is diversity. It's one of those 4 or 5 or 6, depending upon who you are, soil health principles. And one of the reasons that that's important is if you have more different types of plants, the chances are good that you will have some more plants that will thrive in different types of situations that you're up against. A lot of us now in the West, even out here on the prairie where, there aren't very many trees, we're having to think about how to provide shade, and it hasn't been an issue before, as sagebrush has been tall enough until now. But, you might think about having multiple layers in your pastures. Look into silvopasture and agroforestry. An important question is what's going to come back after your catastrophe? And the answer to that is it depends. And that's where I want you to go talk to experienced and knowledgeable people around you. And keep in the back of your mind those principles that Justin just showed about how grazing affects plants and how that affects soils. Think about that as an opportunity. You might be able to use that to shift your plant communities in an intentional way. Here we have crested wheatgrass. It can go out in a drought. It's not the plant that we want as a monoculture everywhere. So maybe you actually graze it really hard as it's coming back. You set it back, you reseed, you get off of it, and you give your natives a chance to prosper. Next, please. In addition to pivoting on your pasture, you could pivot the livestock that you raise. So if your forage situation has changed, maybe there's a better species, breed, class of livestock that could thrive on that. One of the things that we're wondering here in the prairies of Montana is our grass is in really tough shape right now. Sagebrush tends to do better in a drought, deeper rooted shrubs. Goats eat sagebrush, cattle eat grass. Maybe this is a time to have a few goats. Doesn't have to be forever, but maybe think about that. Also, as if you have destocked to deal with the drought, as you think about restocking, ask yourself the question of, do I want to restock to the same level that I was at before, or are things different now? I encourage you to think about the profitability that you might be able to build in by having fewer, better animals, better quality, and better adapted to your particular environment. And you might have been somebody who raised purebreds in the past. And I am such a fan of hybrid vigor and crossbred animals because that builds a level of productivity where the same amount of inputs into your animal in a purebred, those same inputs into an intentional crossbred can have 150% better profitability. So all the same inputs, but a much better outcome. Next, please. And I think the next thing that we can think about pivoting on is your entire business plan. Some of us up here have completely destocked, and the holistic goal is to be a rancher. But maybe what you want to do is you've destocked and you don't know when the drought is going to be over. Maybe instead of just running all your own cattle on your own land, you either lease your land out, you've sold all your cattle rather than buying them at the point in the market when it's really high. Maybe you lease out your land for a while, or maybe you lease out land from someone else to run your livestock. This is Emily Shamlin from Maryland, who's in the picture here with her daughter, and I believe that might be her mother. She raises sheep and mini zebu cattle in Maryland. She's also a world-class shearer. And with Emily, she's got goods that she produces. She's got those sheep, but she also has services. So can you pivot during this time when you have less stock or you're rethinking things? What services could I provide that could make it so I don't have to make so much money off of the goods that I sell? Agri-solar, the idea of being able to provide the livestock that graze under solar arrays, interesting idea, especially popular a little further back east. Agrisolarclearinghouse.org, learn more about it. Next, please. So one of the things that is a basic principle, whether you're in a catastrophe or you're in the sweet spot when everything's going right, profitability will be highest. Stress and risk will be lowest. When you have a good match between the rhythms of the land and the livestock that you're raising, the life cycle of the livestock that you're raising. And so this is just a simple little thing that anybody can do. On the left-hand side, I've just charted kind of my grass availability. I have, because of the type of place I have, I can count on green grass maybe 2 months a year. If I'm lucky, it might be 4 or 5, but really I can only count on green grass in May and June. And I raise sheep, which have a 5-month gestation period. And I want them to have the heaviest lactation at the time the grass is green. That has me lambing early in May. You can, the details don't matter. You can do it with your own place, but make sure that if you slide one of those wheels over the other, that it makes a lot of good sense, because whether it's good times or bad, that will help you get through it. Next, please. So how do, it's not just all about how I get through a catastrophe. Let's look at some people who are really successful in getting through catastrophes. And these are pictures of a ranch family up here in north central Montana, Dale and Janet Veseth. And they raise red composite cattle, and kind of their secrets of success is following the soil health principles for decades. Dale really understands grass. He knows his plants. He knows which ones thrive and which ones have problems in different situations, and he tailors his grazing to completely work with that. They're moving those cattle. They've got them in big herds. They're moving them frequently. He's got the right cattle. He's a breeding stock supplier. He sells bulls, and he's really adapted his stock to the land that he's on. And the reason he's paying so much attention to this beyond the profitability now is he is building a future for the next generation on that ranch. His family has been in this county since the 1800s, And to him, it's all about the next generation. Next, please. You know, you can do all things right, and your grass, as Justin showed in that high condition graph, you know, you can weather the drought. And he's had more moisture than I have, but he's still in a really serious drought. And yet he has a world of grass there. And so he's good there. But, you know, that's not the only place it whacks you. Catastrophes sometimes happen on multiple levels. And here are the other catastrophe that we're going through is stock water. And one of the things I love about how Dale does things is he brings together just the solid way of, I'm not going to spend a dime that I don't need to, so I'm going to go to the junk pile and I'm going to build something. And I'm going to cobble it together with cutting edge technology like a solar panel, and I'm going to pump water for my cows. And that clean water is really important to the productivity of the cows anytime, but especially in a year when it goes up to 113 degrees. Next, please. And I think, you know, I talked to Dale and Janet a couple nights ago, and I said, so what's the secret sauce? You guys are going through this horrible drought that we're all going through, and yet your cows look good and your land looks good. What's the secret? And what Dale and Janet told me is it's simple. Always plan, monitor, learn, partner, and most importantly, take care of the land and each other. Next, please. And so now let's meet one more rancher who's been through it, has been through catastrophes, and has some advice for us to how to come out the other side. Eric, would you like to unmute and maybe turn on your video? Take it away.
Well, thank you. This is a great program. Justin did an excellent job. We live in Ordway, Colorado, and our catastrophe probably started 120, 150 years ago. This country was all irrigated, and it was dried up, and the water was sold, and nobody really did anything with the land. They just kind of, you know, abandoned it, so to speak. So we've got lots of acres that look like a vacant lot, and it's very bacterial, very compacted, not a lot of grass, mostly forbs, kochia weed and Russian thistle, and all the nasty stuff that everybody worries about. But over the years, we figured out that's pretty good grazable material, and if we just kind of keep our mind in the middle, we can understand how to rejuvenate this land a little bit better. So we use planned grazing. We've used that for years. And I hit a grazing plateau, and things kind of stalled out. We bought this ranch about 410 days ago. And when we took it over, it was a lot of bare ground. So we started moving the cattle daily, multiple times a day. And that really got jump started. And it started to move forward. And then we had all our year's worth of rain in May, 6 inches. And everything kind of just gradually came to a stop. And I kind of just wasn't really for sure what to do. So I kind of started thinking about things a little differently. And number 7 on Justin's program started to speak a lot, because so many times it turns into a system, and systems have failures. And when we're talking about cattle and ranching and grazing, we're not working with the system, and we have to discover the fact that we need to keep pushing ourselves and to understand what's the next thing. So I love to learn, and I'm always trying to learn something. And I got into some information, had a good visit with Nicole on some of this. She's helped me to formulate a program called the Closed Loop. And then listening to what Dick Richardson in Australia has to say, that actually kind of solidified my thinking a little bit more. So what it turned out to be is how can we bring more cattle onto the land and add the right amount of inputs to the cattle to help manage the below ground herd and the above ground herd. And what I really liked about this deal is we were always able to push forward with better cattle and cattle management and then marketing. And we were also leaving a better legacy for our below ground herd. And when we're making our above ground herd better, it's translating into more production, more productive opportunities for the below ground. So now we're looking into some permaculture ideas and some compost and extracts and teas. We're also thinking about doing some key lining. We've got all kinds of tools to work with. We've got everything from a sharpened stick to a satellite in outer space that would help us identify where we are and where we want to go. And the people I've worked with, you know, Bud and Eunice have had an indelible mark on me, because the stockmanship, you can put the cattle exactly where you need them to be for exactly as long as you need to be. And cattle adapt to the grazing management better than the grazer. And the cattle want to perform for you and they want to do a good job. So it's kind of one of those things. Stockmanship is one of the real keys that makes this thing work really well. And then on our grazing, most of this ground is so degraded with so many issues that we've had to learn exactly what we can work with and how we can work with it. So sometimes we don't make a lot of progress on seeing what's happening above the ground, but we get a lot more performance for the cattle when we go through the motions, and then we start to see how things start to work out. Uh-oh, my connection's unstable. We all right? Getting along okay? Okay, good. And that's where I hit that plateau. So I decided to change some things around, and we've had some short-term catastrophes. Wind. We've had more wind than, you know, just a lot of bad wind, 60, 70 mile an hour stuff. So when we were doing a lot of high density, we were really getting into a bad wreck. We were creating wind erosion, and I decided that I needed to change something and become more nimble. So we opened up our pastures and we really dropped our density down. And this was during the brown time. So we were able to make a little better assessment on what we had, and then just monitor cow condition and the manure quality to make sure that we were doing the best we could. And when we when we understand how our cattle are starting to work, we're able to make better decisions. And we would sell the cattle that just weren't quite right, but we were also selling cattle for cash flow. And our heifers, we preg checked them early, and less than 50% were bred, but those were the 50% that I wanted. And we marketed our open heifers for a substantial amount of money per head. So that helped out a whole bunch. And then the heifers that stayed are in the herd. They're not calving ahead nor behind. They're bred to the same bull that everything else is. So we want to eliminate as many extra steps and heartache as possible, and then to just have a program that will work. And if they don't fit into the program, then we go ahead and market them, and they become overvalued to what they are. And bringing that forward with the soil health principles and the 5 M's, actually the 6 soil health principles, the context makes all the sense in the world. So now we're building our ranch with our ideas that are based economically and ecologically, so it's able to move forward how we want to move forward. And very satisfying. And the human mind is capable of doing amazing and great things. And, this is a good place to learn and to make friends. And I'm just blessed and happy to be a rancher. It's economically solid and managing for some of the financial train wrecks, but there's a lot we can do here, a lot, and it's very satisfying.
That's so encouraging, Eric. Appreciate you sharing your story. Next slide, please, Larissa. So this book, The Resilient Farmer by Doug Avery, he's from New Zealand. It's a life-changing book for people who are in catastrophes, because what he does a wonderful job of talking about is there's how you manage your paddocks, what you do with your sheep and with grazing rotations and planting cover crops and different things. But he talks about the top paddock being his brain. And this story is just so heart-wrenchingly honest about the fact that Doug lived on the edge of suicide for years because of a catastrophe that he was going through. And it just, my heart goes out to people who care so much about their land and their families that they just, it makes it harder. The more you love something, the more you care, the more it hurts when things go wrong. And so I would encourage you to look at this book. But the short story, the really important things that I got from him are highlighted here. And basically the idea is to ask for help and take it whenever it's offered, to connect with people, to learn new things, and to stay focused on what you can influence. Stop with wasted worry. So back to the Serenity Prayer, focus on the things that you can really change, because it doesn't matter all the science that we have in our head about how to deal with catastrophe doesn't help if you lose hope. But with hope, everything else good can follow. So let's go to the next slide, please. And that's definitely been my summer. We started by talking about the catastrophe that is the drought in Montana right now. And I've told you that my grass-based stock are all in the corral. They're all doing bale grazing out on the pasture in a tiny park. And this is because in order to be able to have good things happen when it finally does rain, right now the priority has to be to save my grass. I need to save it out there so that the grass can save the soil, and then the soil can save all of us. And so, looking at those sheep in the corral, it feels pretty bleak. And then it really got hard. Because this drought is widespread, and my sister, who ranches with her family in Washington, committed suicide this fall. That's why this is so important, is we have options. I grew up on a ranch, and here's what I hear when things go wrong is don't whine. Toughen up, Buttercup. You don't get, if you whine, if you tell people, poor me, it's only going to make it worse. Just get on your horse. And that's what I did as a kid. I just get on my horse and I would just ride away from problems. Somebody else took care of it. I could come back and things were okay. But I'm the grown-up now. I can't ride away from them. And so what do I do? You know, part of it is talking to Justin, you know, bouncing ideas off of him. My background is similar to his, but it's always good to have somebody to check out the science on. You know, what else can I do? You know, as I've thought about this, when I called my friends to say my sister was gone, I was absolutely taken aback. You know, made 20 some calls to people that really needed to hear it from me. And what I found is there was not a single person I talked to who hadn't thought about suicide themselves, hadn't lost a friend or a family member to suicide, or hadn't worried that I was going to do it because they know how much I love my livestock and my land. And they just thought, you know, I look vulnerable out here. And, you know, every single phone call I made, and yet none of those people are talking about it in everyday work. And what I learned, you know, my sister, she always had a smile on her face. Nobody can believe that she did this because she always had a smile on her face. She was there for everyone. She's solving problems. She was an FFA advisor, a 4-H leader, officer of cattlewomen's, the rural fire chief. She did it all, and she did it with a smile on her face. And then one day she couldn't do it anymore, and she was gone. And we're not talking about this. And one thing that I learned, because that's how I cope with stuff, is I have to learn. And one thing that I learned is often a person who commits suicide will think about it for less than 1 hour before they make the decision. And what is important is to build the resilience ahead of time, to build connections. And I raise sheep. And so I always have wool around. And I got to thinking, you know, people are like sheep's wool. So, you know, it's like on our own, we're very fine, we're very adapted, we're good at what we do, but it takes nothing to break us. You don't even have to pull to break one person who's alone. If you have a bunch of people who kind of know each other, and you know, a bigger bunch of people, and they kind of know each other, but they don't talk about things, you can still pull and break it apart. But here's the deal. If what you do is think about catastrophe as something that spins you in a circle, and then you take those same people who are getting spun around by a catastrophe, but they're talking and working together, here's what happens. Instead of having one slender thing that can break, you can create yarn, you can create a community. Maybe you live in several communities in your life. Maybe you have your family, maybe you have your neighbors, maybe you have church like me, maybe you have a great bunch of people that you work with. And so you create, instead of one alone, you create an interactive, self-supportive ply. So this is 3 different levels, 3 different threads that I just spun. And now I can't break it. And that's just 3 groups working together. If what we do is come together as people who are working on regenerative agriculture, we can all come together, and you can create something that is strong enough to literally drag your car and your pickup around. And it's because we would come together in catastrophe instead of falling apart. And if you're in this situation, I'd love for you to call me. Eric put his phone number up there. Eric, this is something that we've talked about. We're going to be starting in Soil for Water, where we have our forum there, and we're going to be starting a group on growing hope. growing hope, how we can do that together. I hope you'll join us there. If you're in a problem, reach out. Please reach out to someone. Call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Don't give up. You are precious. And when we are vulnerable, and when we are compassionate, and when we reach out to each other, that is how we can bounce forward from catastrophe. So thanks for listening. I'm sorry for crying, but it's important stuff. Justin?
Thank you, Linda, for sharing all that you did. Your personal experiences with your family really helped to bring this all front and center and for each and every one of us. So thank you so much for sharing what you did. And as we're wrapping up here, folks, at least for the part of the presentation that I handled, really, if you only get one thing from any of the parts that I shared, it's really that, in order to bounce forward from a catastrophe, we need to focus our grazing management efforts on the soil. Our success will be based on whether or not we treat the soil as a living, breathing organism. So Linda and I are both available at the emails above. You can find us daily on the free public soil health forum at Soil for Water. You can visit us there to tell us your story, post a question, share a success, and build relationships with others on the regenerative journey. And now we'll take some questions. So please type your questions in the Q&A box, and then any questions we don't get answered today, we'll answer those in the forum at the Soil for Water website.
Thank you, Linda and Justin and Eric. That was amazing. It's really wonderful to have you all here. We do have some questions that were typed in as we went that you can, we'll read out loud and everyone can see the Q&A as well. I'm also going to put up, just before we lose folks, a quick exit survey. So as we're listing, kind of fielding questions, feel free to take a minute to fill this out. So one moment on that. Okay. So the first question we have is an example of a catastrophic event for pasture. And I saw, Linda, that you wanted to answer that live. Or Justin.
An example for a catastrophic event for a pasture. I'm forgetting, Larissa. Where?
This was the first question that came in on the Q&A. It was a pretty open-ended question, I think.
Yep. Yeah. So what type of catastrophes can happen on pasture? Yeah. Maybe other than drought. Yeah. Justin, if you'd like to touch on some of the things that you've seen in other parts of the country, we talk about drought so much right now. There's about a webinar a day on it, but how about people with floods and tornadoes and things like that?
Yeah. So, you can have catastrophes that are like a single quick event, such as a fire coming through. If you live in the West and you're in a non-irrigated environment, fire is something that can definitely be on your mind. That's an event that can be very sudden and happen very quickly. Other things as well is, you've got, like Linda had mentioned, you got flooding, you've got, a grasshopper infestation that comes through. My wife used to live in Nevada, and they had 2 years when she was growing up where the grasshoppers were so thick, so intense, that they ate every living thing around where they lived, including the paint off their house. That's the type of a catastrophe that's almost like a biblical proportions. So these catastrophic events can come in all sorts of different forms. The other thing too is, when we start talking about drought, it's not only just that lack of precipitation, but it's also that intense heat. Linda, she shared that in her case, not only did they not, didn't hardly get any measurable precip for months and months, but then they were getting up to temperatures that were like 113. And that's really hard on vegetation. It's hard on soil life when you're getting up to temperatures like that. So, whether you're talking about prolonged periods of low precipitation or no precipitation, or you're talking about intense heat, which then dries out the soil, can dry out the soil tremendously fast. Those are all examples of different types of catastrophes that can happen on pasture.
So Justin, just quickly as a follow-up, maybe people don't realize that or don't understand fully that all those principles that you put forward, if it's taken your grass back down to nothing, it's the same path forward, really, to some extent, no matter how the catastrophe occurred. There's a part of it that is how fast it occurred. Was it like a fire that went through or flood that went through, versus a drought that goes on. But really, the information that Justin provided us is going to be helpful whatever type of disaster you've got in your pasture disaster, whatever it is.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Those 4 soil health principles that I shared, when we were building this presentation, you really can't talk about one principle as far as from a management perspective of what you would do to enhance that principle soil health without also touching upon the other 3 principles at the same time. So when you look at, what's that strategy moving forward, whether we're trying to keep the ground covered, whether we're trying to minimize disturbance, whether we're trying to increase biodiversity, whether we're trying to keep a living root in the ground as much throughout the year as possible, the strategies and moving forward, which, I gave out those 7 guidelines. Those 7 guidelines, cover all 4 of those soil health principles. Whether you've got that pasture that's got very low health and you've got a lot of bare soil out there, or if you're, somewhere midway up, those principles are very tried and true, and they work anywhere in any environment. Whether we're talking, Malta, Montana, or whether we're talking, Tallahassee, Florida, and everywhere in between.
Thank you. Just a quick note to folks that are asking, I will be sending out links to the slides and the recording in the morning, and those are publicly accessible for anyone in your networks that might be interested in watching or reviewing them. So let me we'll have time for a couple more that came in. We have one from Jane who asks, I'd like to have my lambing take place in the same place each spring because it's close to the house and easier for me to make sure everyone's okay. Can I do anything to counteract the damage this might cause to diversity, et cetera? They do come back through those paddocks at various times the rest of the season.
Justin, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So there's a number of things that that you can we do things oftentimes to make things easier on ourselves from a labor standpoint. But when you look at your fields, if you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 different fields, whatever it is, really what your goal is, and I touched upon this. I think this was that seventh guideline, is that you want to stagger the timing in which animals arrive in that pasture from one year to the next. So, for example, you may have 2 fields that are fairly close to you, maybe 3, but maybe year 1, you're in that first field in the spring. But then year 2, what you would want to do is, instead of grazing that field in the spring, you'll want to switch that to like either a late summer or an early fall grazing. So, what it comes down to is that, the the pasture gets memory, just like our bodies do, when you keep doing the same thing repeatedly over and over and over again. And that's kind of the beauty of, staggering that out. So when you look at your place, look for ways that, and kind of develop maybe a 3 to 5 year plan. So in year 1, this is going to be your rotation. And then year 2, you're going to want to change that up again so that you can kind of see where you need to be when, basically you're making a projection into the future, which is then going to be dependent on how things actually play out. But really important to not have your animals coming back to the same place at the same time every single year. That's I couldn't emphasize that enough. I mean, I've actually seen where pastures have really reverted and gone in reverse over a period of time where they just became, very simplistic. Only a few species would be able to survive, and I'm talking about plant species. And when you stagger things up, change things up, then that helps to prevent that from happening.
I'll just follow up a little bit, Jane, in that Janet McNally from Minnesota has really looked into this a lot. And if you'll email me, lindap@ncat.org afterwards, I can send you some links to some of the talks that she's given. But I'd also encourage you to think about, can you use Electronet to partition it up? And even if you're making little half-acre paddocks and moving them along, that can help. I know that if you have sheep, you're dealing with predator and parasite issues. And with predators, you kind of want to keep them in the same place with your dogs or your protectors all the time. And with parasites, you want to keep them moving. Janet McNally talks very, very well about that, and I'd be happy to send that out. In fact, maybe what I'll do is I'll put that information on the Soil for Water forum, and let's talk about it in there, because Janet's she's agreed to do a little podcast with me, and that would be a great thing for us to talk about. So thank you for bringing that up, and best of luck with you on that.
All right, thank you. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Let's take one last question that came up, and then I'll be sure to CC Linda and Justin on my follow-up email tomorrow so everyone is connected. But this question came in also from Peter. Holistic management idea suggests that destocking is counterproductive to the benefits of grazing animals on the land. Are we discussing short-term reactions to catastrophic events or basic land management principles?
We are discussing. Go ahead, Justin.
Oh, go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, it's agreed that that good grazing management is completely compatible and, in fact, essential to healthy grasslands. So we're not saying that cows are bad. It's not the cow, it's the how, as we all say. When you do not have the forage, you do not have a place to have your livestock out there. So it's a short-term response to a short-term problem. If you have a situation that's changing where there's permanent changes in the carrying capacity of your land, then you need to look at longer-term changes. But that is not what we were talking about here. It's just making sure that you are within the carrying capacity of your land and how you manage your livestock. As Justin said, one big herd moving more frequently, higher stock density, completely compatible with holistic management.
Yeah, and I just like to add to what you said there, Linda. In reading or if in following holistic management principles and what they suggest doing is a big part of managing your landscape holistically is that monitoring piece. So one thing that a lot of people do is they track daily precipitation, and they kind of build into their management plan if they don't receive a certain amount of precipitation by a certain date, they immediately engage a destocking plan. And this may be months before the drought gets so nasty and so long where everybody else is trying to destock all at the same time. So if you go into your holistic management textbook, especially if you go into the handbook, they actually have a couple pages in there that shows the advantages of selling a few animals early on, months before most people are selling animals. And they actually do a pretty good job in that publication showing that the sooner you make the decision to start to destock, the fewer animals you actually have to destock. It makes a bigger difference in the grand scheme of things. Whereas if you hang on to the animals till the very bitter end, then you end up, when you do have to destock, you got to destock a lot of animals, and then you're doing it at a time when everybody else is trying to destock. So that's really, that's a really critical piece in trying to, minimize your losses as much as possible and trying to weather yourself through, a drought situation.
I think we might be getting the cue to wrap this up. So let me do just a little bit of housekeeping before we officially call it quits. I will be sending out a recording and the slides and a resource list to you all in the morning. It's going to be, everything will be archived on our website. And I will also send the questions from the question and answer section to Justin and Linda, so they have them, because I know we didn't get to everything. Just a quick plug for some other stuff that we have coming up next week. Steve Gabriel, silvopasture expert, will be with us for the first of a two-part series about converting woodland to silvopasture. And so I will send the links to all of the opportunities coming up in my follow-up email. I am afraid that it is time to say good night or good afternoon. Linda and Justin and Eric, it was really a pleasure. It was an honor to have you all on. This turned into a really, really special session. And I think it was really well appreciated, and it will be helpful as we go forward and people watch the replays as well. So thank you for spending the time preparing and all the effort and energy in presenting. We appreciate it so much. And to my colleague Samantha, who was helping me behind the scenes, thank you for being here tonight, as always. And then everyone out in the audience, it's been a pleasure. It's just wonderful to get everyone's feedback and to have your questions and your input and your thoughts and questions. So thank you for being with us, and I hope that you'll be able to connect with us and stay connected with us as we go forward, and enjoy your evening and the rest of your week. So everyone stay warm. Thanks again.
Hey, Larissa.
Yeah.
Larissa,
yes.
don't forget the chat.
Yes, I'm going to save the chat right now.
Everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Okay.